The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on the world. It tore at the pines until they screamed, and it scoured the high plains, stripping them down to frozen dirt and iron-hard rock. It was a merciless wind, a wind that spoke of an ending. And in the heart of that wind, curled in a hollow at the base of a skeletal aspen, was a small thing that was very nearly ended. She was a girl, though it was hard to tell. Her form was a bundle of rags, so thin and still it might have been a trick of the snow, a drift that had gathered in a vaguely human shape. Her hair, the color of dead corn silk, was matted with ice. Her skin, where it showed through a tear in her sleeve, was the blue-white of skimmed milk. In her arms, clutched to her chest with a ferocity that defied the cold seeping into her bones, was a small leather-bound book, a ledger. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was a shallow whisper, a faint flag of surrender to the overwhelming cold. This was a place of forgetting, a place where the land was too hard and the sky was too big for memory or mercy. It was a place where a life could be snuffed out as easily as a candle flame in a gale, unnoticed and unmourned. And on this day, under the weight of a sky, the color of a fresh bruise, a life was about to end. But a strange and terrible miracle of the universe is that sometimes, at the very moment one story is closing its final page, another is just beginning to be written. A story not of endings, but of reckonings. And the man who would be its author had no idea the ink was about to spill. He was a mile away, leaning into that same wind, his heart as frozen as the ground beneath his feet. He called himself Jacob, though he had not felt like that man in a very long time. The man he was now had no name. He was a shape, a ghost, haunting the edges of his own property, defined only by the fences he mended and the silence he kept. The cold did not bother him. He had been cold on the inside for 10 years, a deep cellular cold that no fire could ever hope to touch. This wind was just an echo of the one that lived inside his own chest. He was checking the north fence line, a ritual born of habit rather than necessity. No cattle had grazed this land in years. The barn stood yonder, a great hollow skeleton against the sky, its timbers groaning. He kept the fences up because it was something to do, a task, a reason to meet the day and then to let it go. Each repaired wire was a stitch in the fabric of a life he was merely enduring, not living. His face was a road map of loss, each line carved by grief. His eyes, once a clear and steady blue, were now faded and distant, the color of a winter horizon. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had nowhere to be and no one to get there for. Something was wrong. A flicker of color against the endless white, down by the creek bed where the old aspens grew thick. It was a dirty red, the color of old blood on a bandage. He squinted, his eyes watering from the wind. A piece of cloth, maybe, snagged on a branch, but it was too low, too still. He turned his horse, the animal grunting in protest against the biting wind, and urged it down the gentle slope. He was a man who minded his own business because he believed the world had no business left for him. Whatever it was not his concern. He told himself that 3 times, but his feet, guided by a phantom limb of conscience he thought long since amputated, kept moving. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was not a bundle of cloth. It was a child. No. The word was a punch to his gut, a soundless crack in the ice of his soul. No, 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 no! He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking into the snow. He approached slowly, as if stalking a wounded animal, a terrible and familiar dread rising in his throat. He had seen death. He had been a lawman in a life before this one. He knew its stillness, its weight, its utter finality. He expected to find it here, in this small frozen heap. He knelt. 5 years old, maybe 6, a girl. No coat, just a threadbare dress and thin worn shoes that were no match for this kind of weather. Her face was a pale, perfect oval, framed by that frozen hair, and clutched in her arms that book. He reached out a hand, his fingers thick and calloused, hesitating an inch from her cheek. He was afraid to touch her, afraid she would be as cold as the stone he felt in his own heart, afraid she would crumble into dust and memory. Then a small, impossible puff of white vapor escaped her lips. She was breathing. Something inside him, a rusted and seized mechanism, lurched into motion. It was not thought. It was not emotion. It was an instinct, older than grief, deeper than bitterness. It was the primal command of a living thing in the presence of another dying thing. Help. Before we see what this broken man does next, I want to take just a moment to thank you for being here with us. Stories like these are about connection, about finding a flicker of warmth in the cold, and your presence here makes that possible. If you want to be a part of this community and hear more tales that explore the depths of the human heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's a wondrous thing to see how far these stories can travel. We are truly grateful for every single one of you. Now let us return to that windswept hollow and the choice that would change everything. Jacob did not think, he acted. The years of self-imposed solitude fell away like a shed skin, and the man he used to be took over. The lawman, the husband, the father. He shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat, the sudden shock of the wind a brutal slap against his wool shirt. He wrapped the coat around the child, his movement surprisingly gentle. He gathered her into his arms. She weighed nothing. A bird. A shadow. The thought terrified him. He had held his own daughter, remembered her solid, warm weight in his arms. This child felt like a whisper, a thing that could be carried away on the very wind that had tried to claim her. He stood, the small bundle held tight against his chest. He turned his back to the gale, shielding her with his own body as he trudged back toward his horse. The animal whickered nervously, its eyes wide. He mounted, a clumsy and difficult process with his precious cargo, and settled her in front of him, cocooned within his coat and his embrace. The ride back to the cabin was an eternity. Every gust of wind felt like a personal attack, a thief trying to steal the fragile life he held. He hunched over her, his chin tucked down, his own body a living shield. He could feel the faint, shallow rhythm of her breathing against his chest, a tiny drumbeat in the roaring silence of the storm. He did not look at her face. He could not. He kept his eyes fixed on the distant shape of his cabin, a lonely smudge of gray smoke against a gray sky. He focused on the task, on the movement, on the physical reality of the moment. To think, to feel was a luxury he could not afford. That path led to a graveyard, to a small hand-carved headstone he had not visited in a decade. He kicked open the cabin door and stumbled inside, the sudden warmth and quiet a shock to his system. The small space was Spartan, furnished with the bare necessities of a man who expected nothing from life and offered nothing in return. A cot, a rough-hewn table with one chair, a cold fireplace, and a pot-bellied stove that was the cabin's beating heart. He carried her directly to the cot and laid her down with an almost reverent care. He unwrapped his coat from around her. She was so small on the rough wool blanket. A foundling, a ghost. He worked with a grim efficiency. He stirred the embers in the stove, adding fresh kindling and wood until a proper fire roared within its iron belly, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. The air began to lose its sharp, icy edge. He turned back to the girl. Now, in the better light, he could see the full extent of her condition. There were dark bruises on her arms, shaped horribly like fingerprints. A long, shallow cut, scabbed and angry, traced a line across her forehead. Her lips were cracked and blue. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, finding a pulse that was thready and weak. But there, it was there. Section. He felt a surge of something he could not name. It was fierce and protective, and utterly foreign. He filled a basin with water from the bucket by the door and warmed it on the stove. He found a clean rag, one of the few he owned, and gently, so gently, began to clean the dirt and grime from her face. His hands, accustomed to the rough work of mending fences and splitting wood, felt clumsy and huge. He was terrified of hurting her, of waking her, of seeing fear in her eyes. As he dabbed at the cut on her forehead, a memory ambushed him. His own daughter, Sarah, tumbling from a tree. She had been 7. Her face streaked with tears and dirt, a cut in the exact same place. He had carried her home, his heart a frantic bird in his chest. His wife, Mary, had cleaned the wound, her hands so sure and steady, her voice a low, calming melody. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if burned. The memory was a shard of glass in his mind. He had locked these memories away in a dark room and thrown away the key. Now this strange child had picked the lock. He took a deep, shuddering breath and forced himself to continue. He could not afford to fall apart. Not now. He finished cleaning her face and hands, his touch as light as he could make it. He tucked the blankets tightly around her, trying to build a fortress of warmth against the cold that had invaded her so deeply. He noticed the ledger, which had fallen from her grasp onto the cot. He picked it up. It was plain, the leather worn smooth with use. It was not a child's book. It was a book of accounts, filled with columns of names and numbers written in a neat, precise hand. He did not open it further. He placed it on the table, a silent witness in the quiet room. Then he turned to the stove. He found a piece of jerky, some dried beans, the meager contents of his larder. It was not food for a sick child. He remembered Mary making broth, the rich scent filling their small home. He had potatoes, an onion, some salt. He could make a thin broth at least, something warm, something to offer. As he worked, peeling the potato with his jackknife, the silence of the cabin pressed in on him. It was a different silence now. Before, it had been empty, a void. Now, it was a silence of anticipation. It was filled with the soft sound of the girl's breathing. He had not had another person under his roof in 10 years. Not since the day he had buried Mary and Sarah. After the funeral, he had packed a bag, sold what little they had, and walked away from the life he had known. He had bought this remote plot of land, a place where no one would know his name or the story that had broken him. He had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, constructing not a home, but a tomb for a living man. He had succeeded. He had become a ghost. But now a small, half-dead child lay on his cot, and he was making soup. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was a man who had prayed for the world to leave him alone, and the world had answered by laying its most vulnerable and broken piece at his very feet. Hours passed. The broth simmered on the stove, filling the small cabin with a simple, savory aroma. The storm outside began to abate, its furious howl softening to a mournful sigh. Jacob sat in the lone chair, watching the girl. He did not sleep. He did not move. He just watched, a sentinel at the bedside of a stranger. He studied her face in the flickering firelight. There were faint freckles across her nose. Her eyelashes were long and dark against her pale skin. She looked peaceful in sleep, the deep lines of fear and pain momentarily erased. She looked, he thought, with a painful clench in his chest, like a child was supposed to look. Sometime near dawn, she stirred. A tiny whimper escaped her lips. Her eyes fluttered open. They were a deep, startling green, the color of moss in a shaded forest. For a moment, they were unfocused, cloudy with sleep and fever. Then they found him. Terror. Pure, absolute terror. It was a physical thing, a wave that washed over her small features. Her eyes widened, her mouth formed a silent O of fear. She scrambled backward on the cot, pressing herself against the cold log wall, pulling the blankets up to her chin like a shield. She looked at him as if he were a monster, a wolf at her bedside. Jacob froze. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to comfort her, but he knew it would be the worst possible thing he could do. He remembered calming a spooked horse, the lessons his father had taught him long ago. You do not rush. You make yourself small. You show you are not a threat. He slowly, deliberately slid from his chair onto the floor, wincing as his old knees protested. He sat cross-legged, a good 10 feet away from her, making sure his hands were visible, resting loosely on his knees. He did not look directly at her, but kept his gaze soft, fixed on the floorboards between them. "Easy now," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, rough from years of disuse. It sounded alien and loud in the quiet room. He winced. He tried again, pitching it lower, softer. "Easy. You're safe here." She did not move. She just watched him, her breathing coming in short, panicked little gasps. He could see the frantic beating of a pulse in the hollow of her throat. He knew he had to break the terrible silence, to fill it with something other than her fear and his own inadequacy. "There's a storm outside," he said, his voice quiet and even. "A bad one. You were out in it. I found you and brought you in here to get warm." He waited. She said nothing. Her eyes were locked on him, wide and unblinking. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, the words feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. When was the last time he had needed to reassure someone? He remembered the broth. It was still warm on the stove. He rose slowly, making his movements predictable and unthreatening. He turned his back on her to ladle some of the thin soup into a tin cup. He could feel her eyes on his back, a physical pressure. He knew this was a moment of trust. He could not make any sudden moves. He turned back around, holding the cup. He did not approach the cot. Instead, he walked back to his spot on the floor and sat down again. He placed the cup on the floorboards, halfway between them, a silent offering. "You must be hungry," he said softly. "It ain't much, but it's warm." He settled back, resting his hands on his knees again, and he waited. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind around the eaves. The girl did not move. Her eyes darted from his face to the steaming cup and back again. He could see the war playing out within her, the deep, ingrained fear of a strange man, and the raw, gnawing ache of starvation. He could almost feel her hunger himself, a hollow pain in his own stomach. How long had it been for her? Days? He could see it in the sunken hollows of her cheeks, in the desperate intensity of her gaze. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, she began to move. She crept from the wall, her movements fluid and silent like a fawn's. She kept her eyes on him, never looking away, as if expecting him to lunge at any moment. When she reached the edge of the cot, she slid off, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She paused, crouched, a small feral thing ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Jacob did not breathe. He did not move a muscle. He made himself as still as the furniture, a part of the landscape of the room. She took one more hesitant step, then another. Her small hand, trembling, reached for the tin cup. Her fingers brushed against the warm metal. She snatched it up, her movements quick and furtive, and scurried back to the safety of the cot. She huddled against the wall again, holding the cup in both hands, pressing its warmth to her chest. She did not drink. She just watched him over the rim, her eyes dark and suspicious. "It's all right," he whispered. "Go on." She took a tentative sip, then another, more confident this time. And then she was drinking, gulping the warm liquid down with a desperate, shuddering need that was painful to watch. A small sob escaped her, a sound of pure relief and misery all at once. She drank until the cup was empty, then looked down into it with a kind of forlorn surprise, as if she couldn't believe it was gone. She looked up at him, and for the first time the terror in her eyes was mingled with something else. Confusion, uncertainty. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He had crossed a bridge. He did not know where it led, but he knew he could not go back. The day unfolded in a series of these quiet, careful negotiations. He offered her more broth, and she took it. He added a small crumbled piece of hardtack to the cup, and she ate it with the same desperate hunger, her small hands shaking. She did not speak, not a single word. She just watched him with those huge, haunted green eyes. He went about his chores, moving slowly, explaining his actions in a low murmur. "Just putting more wood on the fire. Going to fetch some more water now." He felt a fool, talking to himself, but he remembered that was how you gentled a wild thing. You made your world predictable. You filled the silence with a calm, steady sound. You became a source of warmth and food, not fear. By late afternoon, the fever had begun to take hold. A rosy flush appeared on her cheeks, and her eyes grew glassy. She began to shiver, even huddled under the thick wool blankets. Jacob cursed himself for not being a doctor, for his own uselessness. All he could do was keep the fire stoked and bathe her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. She drifted in and out of a restless, muttering sleep. Her words were disjointed fragments of a nightmare. "No, please, Mama, run, the book. He's coming." He sat by the cot, listening to her fevered whispers, and a cold, hard knot of anger began to form in his belly. Someone had done this to her. Someone had put this terror in her eyes, in these bruises on her skin. Someone had left her to die in the snow. The anger was a welcome feeling. It was clean and hot, and it burned away the fog of his own stale grief. It was an emotion with a purpose. Toward evening, the fever broke. The shivering stopped, and she fell into a deep, natural sleep. Jacob watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, the knot of tension in his own shoulders easing for the first time all day. He sat at the table, the ledger in front of him. He knew he should not look. It was her property, her story, but her whispered words, "The book. He's coming," echoed in his mind. This was not just a child lost in a storm. This was something else. This was trouble. And he, a man who had fled from all the trouble in the world, had just invited it into his home. He opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous records, dates, names, figures. It looked like a shipping ledger, but the names were of local ranchers and homesteaders, people he knew by reputation, and next to their names were sums of money that made no sense. Payments for protection, for water rights, for land surveys. It was a detailed accounting of systematic extortion. It was a record of a quiet, brutal war for control of the valley. And at the top of every page, one name was written, the recipient of these funds, a name that made the blood run cold in Jacob's veins. Bartholomew Shaw, the magnate, the man who owned the mine, the bank, the law. The man who had bought and sold the lives of everyone in this valley for 20 years. The man Jacob had once tried to stop. He slammed the book shut, his hand trembling. He understood now. The girl wasn't just running from the cold. She was running from Shaw. This book was proof. It was a death sentence. He looked over at the sleeping child. Who was she? Whose daughter was she? Someone brave. Someone who had tried to fight back against a monster. Someone who had paid the price. He felt the old, familiar weight of failure settle on him. 10 years ago, he had been the sheriff of a town 100 miles from here. Shaw had moved in then, too, with his money and his quiet threats. Jacob had tried to stand against him. He had gathered evidence, tried to build a case. But Shaw was too powerful, too well connected. He had Jacob branded a troublemaker, discredited him, and run him out of his own town. The final blow had not been to his career. Shaw had owned the freight company. A brake failure on a steep grade. A wagon crash. A wife and daughter who never came home. There was no proof, of course. There never was with men like Shaw. But Jacob knew. He had known it in his bones every day for 10 years. He had run. He had come here, to this forgotten corner of the world, to hide from the ghost of Bartholomew Shaw. And now, Shaw's war had followed him. It was lying on his cot, breathing softly in the firelight. The bitterness he had cultivated for a decade, that slow-acting poison, began to change. It transmuted into something else, something hard and sharp. It was not the despairing grief of a victim. It was the cold, clarifying rage of a man who had been given a reason to fight back. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a farmer, a recluse. But they remembered the weight of a gun. They remembered the law. He had lost his own daughter to this man's greed. He would not lose this one. The girl woke just before dawn. The fever was gone. Her eyes were clear. She looked at him, sitting in the chair across the room, and for the first time there was no fear in her gaze, just a deep, weary sadness. "Hello," he said softly. She watched him for a long moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was a tiny, fragile thing, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Hello, sir." The formal address, the "sir" from this tiny child, it nearly broke him. "You got a name, little one?" he asked, his voice thick. "Lily," she whispered. "Lily," he repeated. The name was a flower, something beautiful and out of place in this harsh, ugly world. "That's a fine name." He got up and brought her the last of the broth. She took it without hesitation this time, her small hands steady. As she drank, he sat on the floor near the cot. Not too close, just close enough. "Lily," he said gently, "can you tell me what happened? How you came to be out there?" She finished the broth and set the cup down carefully. She looked at her hands, twisting in her lap. Her story came out in those same broken fragments he'd heard in her fever, but clearer now, more chilling in their simple, factual delivery. "Mama worked for Mr. Shaw," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "She kept his books, the real ones." She nodded toward the ledger on the table. "She said he was a bad man, that he hurt people, stole their farms." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "She said we had to leave, that we had to take the book to a marshal in another county. She was afraid. I saw her crying at night." Jacob's heart felt like a lead weight in his chest. He could picture it all. A desperate woman, trying to do the right thing, trying to protect her child. "The men came," Lily continued, her voice going flat and emotionless, the way people do when they talk about the unspeakable. "The man with the scar on his face. Mama hid me in the cellar. She gave me the book. She told me to run and not stop, no matter what I heard." Her eyes grew distant, looking at a horror only she could see. "I heard her scream," she whispered, "just once. Then I ran. I ran for a long time." She looked up at him, her green eyes wide and filled with a terrible adult knowledge. "They killed her, didn't they, sir?" The question was not a question. It was a statement, a fact she had been forced to accept. Jacob could not speak. He could only nod, a single tight jerk of his head. The cold rage inside him was now a white-hot fire. The man with the scar. He knew that man. A hired thug named Kane who had been Shaw's shadow for years. Lily absorbed his confirmation with a terrifying stillness. She did not cry. It was as if she had no